Hello, I'm Bhagat Oinam. I'm professor of philosophy at Jawaharlal Nehru University. Today, I shall be speaking on a theme uh, on feminist studies, but within that, I suppose that is the larger title on feminist studies, theory, and practice. Uh, that is what Ramanujan College has formulated as the theme of this refreshers course. Uh, I shall be focusing on a specific theme, which I have put it as uh, feminism and issues related to philosophy. So I shall be focusing more onto the very conception of feminist studies and feminism, certain philosophical articulation on the very nature of the concept, how we understand it. That will form the first part of my lecture. In the second part, what I shall do is I shall pick up certain cases from the textual studies from the Indian tradition and try to reflect on the issues of feminism or particularly issues of gender. And I do not have a focused ideological positioning, but my job will be largely focused on the issues related to the gender and how it has been understood in Indian philosophical tradition, and try to keep it as open as possible for the participants to reflect and form your own opinions. So, a broader theme that I would like to put up is uh, gender and issues related to gender in philosophy. Uh, if we begin with the conception of feminism, I would put it as an ideology. This is slightly in variance to what Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy would try to explain. Uh, you must have noticed that Stanford Encyclopedia entry on feminism and feminist philosophy articulates this feminism as an intellectual commitment and political movement. That is what has been articulated. Let me add one more onto this, that I see feminism more as an ideology. As much as liberalism is an ideology, Marxism is an ideology, and this ideology is supported and framed philosophically with certain philosophical worldviews. So, feminism as an ideology also is framed, articulated philosophically. So, it is both an ideology as well as a philosophical thought. That is how I would like to put it. Uh, the statement that feminism or feminist study is more of an intellectual commitment is something very interesting to look at. Uh, the idea of commitment is strangely interesting in the sense that in philosophy we try to be as objective and as far as possible universal in our articulation of any philosophical idea or thought. And that is how philosophers across time has been focusing more onto concepts which are more generic in nature. to avoid particularity, variables, and that which shifts from one point to another. So the philosopher's desire to look for universality and objectivity has also tried to see that every concepts that are being articulated are made into what you call passionless, passionless, which is less emotive, which is objective and true to the nature of the study that philosophers engages with. Now, the idea of a commitment is something very interesting in the sense that once you say, I'm committed to this, that means I adhere to or I abide by certain positions, certain philosophical positions, certain values. So if you are adhering towards certain values or worldviews prior to your investigation, then one might also challenge that one is uh, getting little biased towards our study of the subject. Now, this whole articulation that feminism is an intellectual commitment is something very interestingly challenging to what you had been or what we had been finding, that philosophy is always about the objective, about the universal, and which is invariant, to use the word of Professor Dayakrishna. The, the search for the invariant uh, somehow seems to contradict with the idea of commitment. Because once you are committed, then you are adhering to certain values and worldviews to begin with. So this move, and another word you will find that from the entry in Stanford Encyclopedia is that it is a political movement. Now, the whole idea of a movement itself is quite interesting. And this is not the first time that you find the idea of movement in the history of philosophy. In fact, 20th century has seen several movements, intellectual movements, uh, which challenges the very idea of very disinterestedness in philosophy. That philosophy is a disinterested engagement, that it is very universal, objective, less variant, and we should go by that objectivity or universality. Now, this has been challenged, if you remember, during the middle of 20th century when existentialist movement emerged against the kind of nationalist outlook, against the kind of deterministic positioning, both in terms of ideology as well as in political positioning across nations, where the idea of the nation overtook the priority of the individual self. And an intellectual movement came up in Europe, which again got spread out in other parts of the world. So feminism is yet another movement that challenges what you call the universality of our intellectual discourse. And within this, I would like to submit a couple of cases which all the participants, I presume, are already aware of. But even if it is a repetition of what you might have already heard from other uh, resource persons, or you have already studied in detail on these cases, still I would like to bring those for your consideration, because that is where I would like to develop. the very idea that in English language, uh, the term man, when we translate the Greek, the Aristotle's writing into English, the translation of the human species as it is commonly used across text is the word man. And if you asked a question that why man and why not woman, uh, very conveniently the answer comes, and mainly from the main philosophers and scholars of philosophy, is that, oh no, man also represents women. So basically, man is only a uses, but it is basically implying to the human species. But then we know that it was only in the 1960s that, when the first wave of feminism came up, uh, the right to vote, the political right of the women, was first raised. That means women were not given the voting rights to choose your own political representatives. So you can see that at one level, the intellectual discourse says that man implies the human race, women's included, but that's a very beautiful way of making the women's happy, that see, even if the women, the word is not used, man includes all the human species. But in practice, the very fact that the women's did not enjoy the voting rights till the middle of 20th century itself tells a lot, that this man, who is a rational being, seems to be a literal conception, that it literally means the man and not woman. And this man, if you again look further, this man may turn out to be only white man and not necessarily man of every race. It is not even a global man, but man that has been used, whether it is in Kant's writing or in Mill's writing. And we know that while Mill was a champion of human rights, uh, he was also writing declarations on slaves, that how to be treating the slaves and the rights and the non-rights of the slaves. So at the same time. So Europe has seen in the back of their ideologically very profound universalistic conceptions, the actual practices which are literal to the terms, the words that they use. So in other words, what I am submitting is that this word man, which might seemingly look to be a universal human, but in actual it is about a white man, which is bereft of women, number one, and secondly, bereft of the colored man. It is about purely white man, the Europeans, and what you call the North Americans, white North Americans. So there is a lot to look into the very conception of how this philosophical concepts as we use as a universal concepts. This has to be taken with a pinch of salt. Now, it is within this context that when we study feminism as a movement, as an ideology, there is nothing to be very shy about. There is nothing to be ashamed of that. The very fact that our desire to have a universal conception, our desire to have an invariant idea about the things that we understand, that desire is perfectly fine. But it does not imply that desiring the universal will always amount to practicing the universal. Desire is always about a possibility which is yet to be achieved. So we might desire universality, but in actual practice, philosophers must not shy away from recognizing the very fact that we are existing in the world of variables. We are existing in the world of partial fulfillment of those desires. So it is in that sense that feminist movement as a political movement has to be recognized. One, we know that I don't even need to go to the 3 or 4 waves. Now we are also finding writings that there are fourth wave is already coming in. Uh, I am not too much into that, but if you look at each of the focuses of these waves, and waves here implying movement. In fact, it is series of movement one after another, which tries to get recognition of women's rights at various fields. And it also challenges some of the traditional practices and values which we take it as universally accepted or acceptable. And that is where the first wave came up with what you called as right to vote. The second wave was talking, challenging the traditional family system and talking about the civil rights, right? Cultural movement it was. And then you also know that the third was talking about intersectionality, where it is not merely confined to the gender alone, but gender linked with race, with poverty, and similar such areas of marginality. And when different levels of marginality intersect with one another, and that is where the challenges which Judith Butler and others came up with. And then the fourth one, which we are quite familiar now, the Me Too movement has been almost characterizing the fourth movement. What I wish to say with this, bringing in this movement, is that the issues of feminism is not a disinterested universalizing philosophizing. It is not a philosophizing seeking for universal in a very disinterested way, which many philosophers try to do. The feminist philosophizing is very much rooted in everyday life that the women's and also the man experiences. So it is political in the sense that it is seeking for a space where the recognition of the women of its rights, which is due, which has not been given to her, but which is accorded to have been given within a larger blanket terms, which is universal. Like you talk of man, you talk of representations. So all these terms that we use in philosophy are almost taken for granted as if these are universally applicable. Whereas it has failed to, it has not till date, all these values have not been achieved. And the very fact that these movements, these feminist movements, over a period of time, after 1 decade or 2 decades, different waves emerges out, implies that the philosophical conception and values that we take it for granted as universal are at the level of desirable. They are yet to be achieved. And there is nothing to be ashamed of recognizing this very fact that universal conceptions of as used in philosophy are at the level of the desirable, and they are not necessary that we have achieved. And the very fact that this movement has come up implies that uh, they are yet to be achieved. This is a point that I wish to make. Uh, there are few instances in the history of philosophy. We try to say that, put philosophers as, oh, like we know that this has not been happening, but we accord to one or two philosophers saying that this philosopher was a feminist, this fellow philosopher was a patriarch. So, and then debate goes on. And that debate also become very disinterested debate. And that is my problem, that even in this conceptualization, I would like to bring out one or two instances of philosopher, how the debate is centered around them, and also in a very uninteresting fashion. One, you talk of Plato, and somewhere Plato has said that women should also, women have the power of resilience, and they should be also philosopher king. Now, this somewhere Plato has written, and this becomes a rallying point for many scholars of philosophy to put a tag that Plato was a feminist. The very fact that you see that in actual everyday life, uh, equal recognition to genders, equal recognition of rights of every human being, whether it is about gender, it is about race, are all wanting. It is not happening in this present world, the global world that we are living with. So, since it is not in practice, we try to locate one instance of a philosopher saying that he or she was a feminist. And particularly, she will not come because women are supposed to be feminists. So, you will try to locate some man whom you can consider as feminist. So Plato become a feminist for some of the scholars of philosophy. Then you will also find a counterpoint in writings of Plato saying that no, Plato has said something against the women at certain point. So he was not a feminist. So debate goes in a very uninteresting fashion, that you drag in a philosopher, a male philosopher, and then picking up an instance and saying that he was a feminist and he was not a feminist. And there could be contradicting statements that you will find even within one particular philosopher. And this contradiction, mind you, this will form a second part of my lecture when I go to the Indian philosophical tradition. Now, the other philosopher is Friedrich Nietzsche, most controversial. And an interesting statement that he has made, I think, in Beyond Good and Evil, in the preface itself. Suppose that truth was a woman. Now, this is a very controversial statement. So, how would philosopher, what then? How would philosopher engage with? And this statement of Nietzsche has been read and reread, some considering him as a feminist, some considering him as reflecting in the guise of feminism a patriarch. So in fact, the statement is paradoxical because at one level, Nietzsche is suggesting that philosophers being driven by the values of patriarchy have never understood the women, their psyche, their way of thinking, and so on. And he is challenging that philosophers, in their quest for truth, has been trying to be very objective and very universal. But supposing that truth was a woman, how will these philosophers engage with that? Because they have never understood the women, or they have never been able to understand the nature and thinking of the women. So your search for truth is bound to be elusive because you have not been uh, objective enough to understand the nature of women. Now, one way is that he is trying to criticize the philosophers of being biased towards their quest for truth. That could be one way. That is why he has brought in the nature of women. But at another level, why using this word women itself comes from a deeply embedded patriarchal order, that you're giving an exemplar of women, uh, unreadability of women, ununderstandable character of women. This example itself comes from a deep rooted patriarchy. And that is also one way of critiquing uh, Nietzsche. And there are scholarly articles, and I have gone through those articles. That is why I'm uh, engaging myself with you. But I find that both such uh, uh, ways of engaging philosophically is uninteresting, in the sense that it doesn't really go to the core of the issues that feminism comes up with. You are only picking up one philosopher or two and then debating on the text that these philosophers have written. You are arguing whether he or she, not she, but he, the male philosopher was a feminist or not. And this, I think, is a very disinteresting uh, debate, uninteresting at all, because that doesn't go to the crux of the issues that feminism as a movement has come up with. So, what we really need to see is that our commitment to certain values, even prior to our own philosophical investigation, is not something to be ashamed of, to be shy away from. We must not shy away from taking a position and engaging a philosophical problem, even prior to the engagement itself. Because to presume that one is neutral, one is disinterested, I think itself is problematic. Many a times you claim that you are not taking a position, but you are taking a position of status quo. That which is in practice, you are siding with that. That is why one can afford to say that I am not siding with anyone. So you are when you say I'm not siding with anyone, you are speaking from the zone of comfort, and zone of comfort is the status quo which one is enjoying. So taking a intellectual commitment towards rights, equal rights of every gender or racial profile is something that one should not be ashamed of, even prior to philosophically engaging with a concept or a philosophical problem. That is the main crux of my positioning. So, this much I will say, and I shall come back for the second lecture, second part of this lecture. I shall pick up with certain Indian philosophical tradition and some concepts. Thank you.